Nursing school teaches you to memorize fluids and electrolytes, but that's the wrong way to learn them because a list of lab values doesn't explain why babies are so wet and squishy, while the elderly are dried up prunes. And it definitely doesn't explain why intelligent nursing students don't really know what blood is. And I bet you don't either. Why does this happen? It's because you've been trained to focus on isolated facts instead of patterns. But with one simple tweak to your study plan, fluids and electrolytes can finally make sense. This might not be the first slide you expect to see when a tutor is teaching you fluids and electrolytes. But if you do not understand the patterns and the information that I'm going to teach you today, then memorizing symptoms in nursing care about the electrolyte imbalances is a waste of your time. I love you, but I'm going to be blunt. So let's get it over with. You are going to see a diagram in your Fundamentals of Nursing book that looks something like this. It's going to have a baby, it's going to have an adult, it's going to have somebody who's elderly, and they each have a decreasing amount of water. You could go straight from memorizing the ranges for what percentage of their body is water, but I bet you would have a high risk of getting that mixed up on your test if you just did that. Instead, we're going to look for patterns that make it more likely for you to retain this information without straight-up memorization. And here's the patterns. We've all seen a cute, adorable, squishy little baby. So why are they so squishy and pinchable? It's because they have the highest water content they will have for their entire life. In fact, 70 to 80% of their body is water. Knowing this helps you predict symptoms in nursing care for babies and children. Because since their body water percentage is so high, that means small decreases in the water volume can cause big problems. And I can teach you how to intuitively find those problems by studying with my Silver Bullet study system, and I'll have that information at the end of this video. Adults, on the other hand, are pretty well balanced. We're approximately 50 to 60% body water, which means we have the most flexibility when it comes to our water balances and our electrolyte balances. And that tracks. Because of these three groups, adults are the ones least likely to have these sorts of problems. Not saying they can't, we definitely can. But they tend to be more serious in the very young and the very old, like many disease processes. And now you're going to understand why that is. Now, once you're elderly, you drop down to 45 to 55% of water volume in your body. You've basically been evaporating your entire life. This puts you at higher risk for fluid volume and electrolyte problems because since there's less water, smaller changes now are going to have bigger effects. Do you understand what I mean when our body is made up of this much water? Let's say we have a middle-aged adult who's approximately 60% body weight. Where is that water? Because if we stick a pin in me, there's no water leaking out, it's just blood. But spoiler alert, that blood leaking out, it's still mostly water. Let me show you. Understanding this flow chart right here will automatically make understanding edema and ascites and other fluid shifts a lot easier. If 60% of my body weight is water, 40% of that is intracellular. Intra means inside, cellular means cell. We're not very creative with how we name things in medicine. That means that 40% of my body weight is actually water inside all the cells of my body added together. That's pretty important water because our cells can't function unless that water is inside them. The other 20% of my body weight water is extracellular or outside my cells. That kind of makes sense. You can either be inside or you can be outside, but you can't be both. However, the water that is outside of my cells can be split up into two more subcategories. And it's really still an inside-outside sort of differentiation, so super easy to remember. It can either be intravascular, inside our blood vessels. Notice how we have intra and intra. Do not get those mixed up because this is intracellular and this is intravascular. So the 20% of extracellular water that makes up my body weight is divided between the water that's inside my blood vessels and the water that's outside my blood vessels, but it's not inside my cells. And we call that the interstitial space. So this is really like all the tissue and stuff that's, again, outside the blood vessels, but not inside the cell. Intracellular fluid seems pretty straightforward. You can imagine water being inside the cell because they're basically like little water balloons anyway. The interstitial fluid kind of makes sense because water is lubricating all of our internal organs, and we just kind of have this sense that everything's wet inside of us. But what about the intravascular? Inside the blood vessels is where we expect there to be blood. So that begs the question, what is blood? And I bet you don't know. Tell me in the comments if I'm wrong and you really do know. Most people think of blood as that red stuff that comes out of us when we get cut. But it's actually more than that. Blood is not one single thing. It's a group of things, a group of 4 things to be exact. Blood is 55% plasma. And I'm sure you've heard the term plasma, and this is why, because it makes up more than half of our blood. And then red blood cells make up 40 to 45% of our blood. Now, let's be honest, red blood cells is probably what you were thinking about when I asked you what is blood. It's what most people think about. And while it is a huge component, it's not even the biggest one, is it? The third component is white blood cells. And if you remember A and P, there are multiple types of white blood cells. But even that, there's less than 1% of your blood is white blood cells. And then, of course, there's platelets, the little pieces that help you clot when you get a cut, so you don't bleed to death. But even that is less than 1%, which makes the majority of your blood a combination of plasma and red blood cells, with a few little seasonings thrown in just for fun. Now, I'm sure you know what red blood cells are, but that begs the question, what is plasma? What is this stuff that makes up over half of blood? And why is it important to fluids and electrolytes? If you guessed that it's because it's made up of 92% water, you'd be correct. Remember, blood is part of our extracellular fluid volume that makes up our body weight. This means that if plasma is mostly water and blood is mostly plasma, really, blood is mostly water. And it's a good thing, too, because water is what we call the universal solvent. It's the reason why electrolytes can function in our body, because those electrolyte ions can kind of dissolve in the water. And we can see that mineral salts, which is what we call the electrolytes, and also bicarbonates for when you get to ABGs, along with sugars, fats, hormones, vitamins, make up approximately 1% of the plasma. That leaves 7% unaccounted for, and this would be our proteins. You can think of the proteins as being dissolved inside the water as well. And over half of those proteins is the important protein albumin. I'm going to talk about that in a future video, but have you heard of this one? The rest of the protein in the plasma is globulins and immunoglobulins, which has to do with your immune system. Now, why is this important for fluids and electrolytes? Now, if you've been smart enough to make it this far, you might be asking, why does this matter for knowing the symptoms for fluids and electrolyte problems? And that's because you have to understand how water moves in the body to understand those symptoms. And it also helps you understand priority nursing actions. And it all comes down to pressure. Everything in the body, everything in life responds to pressure. And water and electrolytes are no different. For example, if you are trying to understand first spacing, second spacing, and second spacing when it comes to edema, you have to understand how different pressures in the body will force that water out of the space it's supposed to be and into a space it is not supposed to be. First spacing is fine. That's where all the water is exactly where it's supposed to be. Second spacing is when we push that extracellular water and maybe even some of the intracellular water, and it gets pushed out into the interstitial space. Now we have too much water in the interstitial space. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to predict what kind of symptoms you're going to see. You're going to see swelling because water has been pushed out into compartments it is not supposed to be in. And if that pressure increases enough, then that water can even be pushed from second spacing to third spacing and go into places it's really not supposed to be, like the abdominal cavity for ascites. And don't think that only water responds to pressure, because electrolytes do too. But they respond to different kinds of pressure, and I'm going to be explaining those different kinds of pressure to you in 2 videos from now. Make sure to like and subscribe to this video so you get notified when that video comes out. But whether it's pressure or fluid shifts or electrolyte symptoms or nursing care, once you start noticing these patterns in the body, you stop cramming random facts into your spaghetti brain and finally can start thinking like a nurse. This change in thinking doesn't just make fluids and electrolytes easier either. It cuts down your study time and makes every topic in nursing school click faster for you. That's exactly why I train nursing students to use a simple 4-step study process that builds confidence, gets you comfortably passing test scores, and takes the overwhelm out of studying. And I'll be walking you through that 4-step process in the next video.